I am proud to create him Prince of Wales, Tywysog Cymru, the country whose title I've been so greatly privileged to bear during so much of my life and duty.
King Charles has reportedly overruled everything behind palace doors. Inside King Charles III's circle, a shocking order has been issued. A historic diamond brooch collection is being transferred to Catherine, music, triggering immediate questions across royal watchers. Why now? And what does this signal about Queen Camilla's position inside the monarchy? Join us as we break down the decision that has the royal world talking. The meeting that changed everything. King Charles was seated among royal trustees and senior advisors when the meeting began. To anyone observing the room from the outside, it looked like another matter of household administration, the kind of gathering that happens regularly inside a working monarchy, structured, formal, and mostly invisible to the world beyond the palace gates. But the people who understand how the royal machine operates knew this was different. The atmosphere in the room was not the atmosphere of routine management. It carried the weight that only surfaces when the topic is succession, inheritance, or the kind of institutional decision that outlasts everyone making it. At the center of the discussion was Camilla's diamond brooch collection, a set of jewels that had become inseparable from her public identity across the years of her marriage to Charles. On the 9th, music, of April 2005, Charles and Camilla married in a civil ceremony. Pieces that had appeared during major state moments, at national ceremonies, at the kind of occasions where what a royal wears carries more weight than anything they say. These jewels were not just beautiful adornments. They were visible declarations of position and belonging. Catherine had been summoned to the meeting. By the accounts of people close to the situation, she was not expecting the full weight of what she was about to hear. The king had reached a private conclusion. Certain pieces within the collection were tied not to personal comfort, but to royal duty and institutional continuity. And in that distinction, everything had already been decided. By the time Catherine left the room, the documents that palace staff had reportedly prepared before she even arrived were already moving through trusted hands. Senior aides who knew what the preparation of those documents meant understood immediately. This decision had not been made that morning. It had been building for months, perhaps longer, assembled quietly in the background while the public world of the royal family continued its visible routines. By evening, the whispers racing through palace corridors had changed in character. People had stopped asking whether a transfer would happen. They were asking why now, why Catherine, and why Charles had chosen this particular moment, such a clear and deliberate line between personal affection and institutional duty. And behind all those questions sat the harder one that nobody in those corridors wanted to say directly. What did this mean for Camilla? What those jewels actually meant? The diamond brooches did not become central to this story because of their financial value or their physical beauty. They became central because of what they represented in language that royal institutions have always used to communicate the things they cannot say out loud. For generations, royal jewelry has never been simply ornamental. A brooch pinned at a state occasion can communicate more than any formal announcement. A piece worn at the right moment signals continuity, music, approval, loyalty. A piece withheld or moved or placed in different hands signals something else entirely. Every brooch in Camilla's collection carried history. Some had appeared during solemn national events. Some had been worn during the slow and difficult years when she was transitioning from the most controversial figure in the royal family into its queen. Camilla, the most controversial person among the monarchs. Each piece had become associated with a specific chapter of that journey, and the wearing of them had been part of how the palace had gradually constructed the narrative of her acceptance. That was the question that had quietly been building inside royal circles for some time. Were these pieces personal property tied to the woman who wore them and the private life she had built beside Charles, or were they part of something larger, part of the crown's wider story, part of the institutional furniture that outlasts every individual who comes into contact with it? In the royal world, that question is not abstract. Personal jewels follow the person. Institutional jewels follow duty. And once that distinction is applied to a specific collection, the conversation that follows is no longer a family matter. It becomes a formal process with formal consequences. Somewhere in that process, Catherine's name had begun to carry a different weight. She was the Princess of Wales. With Catherine beside him, our new Prince and Princess of Wales will, I know, she was increasingly understood within the palace and by the public watching from outside it as the future guardian of the monarchy's emotional identity, the person who would carry its image into the next reign. The person who had demonstrated through years of disciplined and quietly impressive public service that she understood what the crown required and was prepared to give it. And once that understanding settled into the formal review of the collection, certain conclusions became very difficult to avoid. So, what does it actually mean for her position now? Camilla's position and the quiet pressure building around her. Camilla's rise had never been simple. She had spent years on the wrong side of public opinion, carrying the weight of a role that the British public had initially refused to accept. The journey from that starting point to queen consort was long. Camilla is now the queen, kind of. The new king's darling wife has become the queen consort. And at every stage it had required the active protection and support of Charles. He had stood beside her through the years of public doubt. He had guided her toward acceptance, one careful appearance at a time. He had watched her become gradually, and against significant resistance, a royal figure whom people had come to treat with something approaching respect. That transformation had been real, and it had cost both of them something to achieve it. But inside the palace, acceptance and authority had never been the same thing. Acceptance meant she had a place. Authority meant she could shape what came next. And as the question of succession planning became harder to ignore in the corridors of the royal household, those two different things began to separate in ways that nobody could prevent. William and Catherine's presence in the royal landscape had been growing stronger with each passing year. Not loudly, not through declarations or maneuvers that could be easily identified and challenged, but steadily, undeniably, in the way that tomorrow always becomes more real as today moves toward it. They represented the next reign, and in a monarchy built on continuity, the next reign is always the most important thing in the room, even when it is not the one currently wearing the crown. Camilla's supporters inside the palace had watched this with their own particular anxiety. The brooch collection, to them, represented something concrete and visible about her position. These were jewels she had worn publicly, repeatedly, at the moments when the palace had been most deliberately constructing the image of as queen. They were woven into the visual record of who she had become. To lose them, or to have them formally reviewed and redirected, would not simply be an administrative adjustment. It would be a statement. And inside royal circles, statements made through symbols are never accidental. They are calculated communications delivered through the most durable medium available. Charles understood this. He understood the personal pain that would accompany any such decision, and what it would mean for the woman who had stood beside him through everything. And he sat with that understanding while the advisors around him presented their conclusions in the cold, precise language of institutional duty. But understanding the weight of a decision is not the same as escaping it. Even when every personal cost is clear, institutional choices still have to be made. And once the argument is framed in duty rather than emotion, there is very little room left for hesitation. The decision and what drove it. When the formal recommendation reached Charles, the advisors presenting it had reportedly spent months, doing the preparation. Royal protocols were not only reviewed, historical precedents were also examined, and succession traditions considered from every relevant angle. The conclusion they delivered was both straightforward in its logic and explosive in its implications. If the monarchy's future was the governing priority, the collection needed a new custodian. The advisors were not asking Charles to make a personal judgment about Camilla or Catherine as women. They were asking him to make an institutional judgment about possession versus preservation. In the royal world, those two things are understood very differently. Ownership can be temporary. Stewardship is sacred. And once the question was framed that way, the weight of it shifted from the personal to the permanent. Charles had spent his entire adult life preparing to be king while watching the institution from the outside. He had studied its requirements from a distance for longer than almost anyone in modern history. He cares about its heritage, He cares about the planet, and he cares, music, about the people. And now, sitting inside it,